snap. The kick is in the air, and the kick this time is no, sir-ree. No, sir-ree. Final score, Tennessee 20, Florida 17. Pandemonium reigns.
You're listening to the RTI Podcast, powered by WalkingTopInsider.com.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the RTI Podcast. I am Nathaniel Rutherford, the managing editor of RockyTopInsider.com. Joined today not by Ben McKee, our staff writer. He's got some family in town, so I'm letting him kind of, be able to hang out with his family and do all that. So joining me today is one of our RTI contributors. He's been on the team here for a little while, actually, for a couple months here. You've probably read some of his articles and stuff if you frequent the site at RockyTopInsider.com. But I'm joined this week by Robert Hughes, our contributor at RTI. Robert, let everybody know who you are, kind of do a little brief introduction so our listeners know who you are.
Yeah, thanks, Nathaniel. I'm Robert Hughes. I am currently in school at UT, finishing up my degree, hopefully going to be out of here in December. That's the plan, at least. But yeah, I've been writing with RTI now wrote a little bit for you guys last semester, and then started hitting it pretty heavy this semester. Most recent thing we've got here, of course, would be kind of how the defense took over this past Saturday. Really took on that next man up mentality. Had a couple injuries, of course, Trayvon Flowers being the big one. But yeah, excited to get going here and excited to discuss a little Tennessee football for sure.
Yeah, happy to have you on. You've done a good job writing so far, and you know I've talked multiple different times, obviously off record of the podcast, but you've had podcast experience in the past, so I'm looking forward to our first kind of podcast here, and you all can probably expect to hear Robert on some future podcasts, if not kind of the main RTI podcast. He and I have discussed at least doing maybe some kind of basketball stuff as well, because he and I both are big basketball fans, and we're both very excited about covering Tennessee basketball this season. So if not on football stuff, at least you can expect probably to hear Robert and me do some basketball stuff as well. But Robert, we've got football to talk about here. Tennessee gets a much needed 20-10 victory over Mississippi State over the weekend. A game where Tennessee led from start to finish. That's I wouldn't say it's misleading, but Tennessee did lead from start to finish once they got the first score on the board. But it wasn't like it was a blowout or anything like that. Tennessee never had more than a 10-point advantage. But it was a game where Tennessee, in the lines of scrimmage, kind of on both sides of the ball, really, they dominated. They won. If you're looking at the win, which side won on offense, which side won on defense, Tennessee won both offense and defense in this game, in my opinion. I don't really think you could really argue it any other way. Tennessee picked off 3 passes. They got 7 sacks, 10 tackles for loss, and a few of those sacks were because of coverage sacks. But that's also giving huge credit to Tennessee's secondary for playing very well. On offense, it was a lot more of a conservative game plan than I think you've seen all season for Tennessee. 44 rushes compared to 14 passes, and it was that way for both quarterbacks. It wasn't just Garantano. They didn't. Maurer didn't throw a ton either, and he made a few mistakes before suffering his concussion. But Tennessee did a good job. They did just enough to really, move the ball enough to get some points on offense, and the defense really was just shutting down Mississippi State all game. Robert, I want to ask your thoughts here in just a second. To me, this game, like I said, it was a much-needed victory. It wasn't even, watching it, Tennessee, I think, and I said this in the post-game live stream I do, if you all haven't tuned into that, I don't know if we'll do it after the Alabama game because it'll be very late, but we tend to hear over the last 4 or 5 games or so, we've been doing a post-game show on YouTube, so be sure to check it out. We do a live show. It's usually just me on there, but it is the RTI post-game show. We stream it live on YouTube, and we tweet out stuff and link to it. So if you haven't subscribed to us on YouTube, be sure you do that, and you can catch it when it goes live. But I said it then that I feel like this was probably the most complete team game I've seen Tennessee play, I guess maybe since that Kentucky game last year. And that Kentucky game was, you'd think because of the way Tennessee played that game, they were going to close the season strong, and they obviously didn't. And I'm actually going to kind of touch on that here in a second too. But this, to me, what you saw almost every single facet of Tennessee's offense, defense, and special teams show progress from the beginning of the season to now. and all of them looked improved. And I think this was probably one of the more complete games Tennessee played. Like I said, it wasn't anything majorly flashy on offense, although you did have more splash plays than I think some people you may realize. Looking at what they classify as chunk plays on the StatCast of passes of 15 or more yards and rushes of 10 or more yards. You had 6 passes of 15 or more yards, and you had 6 runs of 10 or more yards for Tennessee. So, all in all, it ended up being Tennessee averaged 6.2 yards per play, which that's pretty good. That's above average kind of yards per play for an offense. They only gave up 4.6 yards per play. To me, Robert, I think what stood out most to me was that, like I said, this wasn't just one side of the ball carrying the other. This wasn't the offense outpacing the defense because the defense was giving a bunch of points. This wasn't the defense clamping down on an offense and Tennessee's offense having to try to find a way to scrounge up a couple points here and there. It was probably a little more defensive heavy, but I honestly think this was one of the more complete games I've seen Tennessee play probably since maybe 2015, because that season Tennessee's defense was pretty good, the offense was pretty good. 2016 the offense was really good and the defense wasn't good. So and then obviously 2017 everyone was bad. Last year it was pretty bad for most of the season. This is probably the most complete game I've seen from Tennessee. I would say at least probably since 2015.
I would definitely have to agree with you as far as just a complete all-around game. Because, if you look at it, the time of possession wasn't too lopsided in Tennessee's favor. It was about 33 minutes to 27 on Mississippi State. So it's not like they just completely, ran it up every single play, dominated. It wasn't huge in favor of Tennessee for time of possession. But Tennessee was able to crank out some longer drives with a balance, like you said, kind of, a little bit of run, and then a little bit of a pass. They had drives of 4.5 minutes, 5 minutes, 7 minutes. And then, of course, on defense, the defense was consistently getting the sacks, getting the 3 and outs, obviously the 3 interceptions. That's the only second time this season that Tennessee's had at least 3 interceptions. The other one, of course, though, is against FCS opponent, UT Chattanooga. So you put a little bit more weight on those interceptions against an SEC team, more so than you do a team like Chattanooga. So I would have to agree with you in the sense that in all facets of the game, whether it be offense or defense, defense front line, you got the linebackers in the secondary. I think all of those facets played very well, and they complemented each other. It gave Tennessee the opportunity once Garantano came in at the end of the first half there, and then all through the second half. It gave him some time to really take some pressure off of him. He made a couple of those chunk plays, like you said. A huge pass there to Ramel Keaton, which a lot of people weren't really expecting because the first 9 plays, I believe it was, of Garantano were all runs, and then you're able to get a chunk pass like that. So I think from top to bottom, you look at offense and defense, definitely a complete game, definitely complimentary football, which, it's not necessarily the prettiest, but it's what you need to win SEC games, especially when you're a struggling team right now.
I'm curious your thoughts on the quarterback play, because I think if Brian Maurer's healthy, if he doesn't have any kind of bad side effects from his concussion that he suffered, and it seems like Pruitt said on Monday that we're recording this on Monday afternoon, so Pruitt just spoke 2-3 hours ago, but he says that Maurer practiced and took some reps on Sunday, and he says he thinks he'll be fine. So I think that likely points to Maurer starting against Bama. You can argue maybe he shouldn't start against Bama because that's going to be a loss, and you don't want him to get more beat up. But it seems like as long as Maurer's healthy, he doesn't have any sort of bad side effects moving forward from his concussion, he's going to be Tennessee's starting quarterback. But Robert, I don't think there should be any sort of quarterback controversy or anything like that, and I think most fans would agree, because I think most fans, for better or worse, are kind of just out on Garantano. I don't think a lot of fans very happy to see him get in the game, even though he had to. But to me, the quarterback play on Saturday, people were talking about how, you mentioned just then, Garantano, they ran the ball 9 straight times that he came in the game for the last 3 plays of going into halftime and the first 6 plays coming out of the half. I said at the time, I thought they didn't trust, the offensive staff didn't trust Garantano. But upon further review of reflection and going back and kind of watching some of the stuff and looking at, just kind of doing a deeper dive in the stats, and like I said, going back and watching some more of the game, I don't know that necessarily was true, and just from rewatching the game and from having a chance to kind of reflect and not just kind of reacting in the moment, because as I said earlier, they weren't. I think they took some risks with Maurer. They were letting him kind of throw the ball a little bit more early on, and it wasn't paying off. I mean, he threw 2 bad interceptions. He made some good throws. I will give him credit. He did make some very good throws. He made a good throw. The first completion of the game to Dominic Wood Anderson was a 28-yard strike that he hit Wood Anderson right where he should have hit him, and I think Wood Anderson maybe bobbled it a little bit, but it was still a good throw. He made a good throw to Josh Palmer. He made another good throw that I'm struggling to remember who he completed it to now, but he made some. I think all but one of his completions were really actually good throws. He just made some really bad decisions that you can't make even if you are a true freshman making your second career start. They're mistakes that he's very lucky that Tennessee's defense was playing the way they played and that they were able to kind of bail his butt out and help Tennessee win. But I think Garantano came in, he played well, he managed the offense, he made some good throws, he was 3 of 3 on third down. I'm just kind of curious your thoughts in general on the play of the quarterbacks, because I thought it was a conservative game plan from start to finish. I think looking at the stats right here, right in front of me, Tennessee threw the ball 7 times in the first half. All of those were from Brian Maurer. They ran the ball 20 times. Second half, they threw the ball 7 times. All of those were Garantano, and they ran the ball 24 times. So it wasn't like there was a drastic difference in play calling. Tennessee ran the ball 9 times in the first quarter, passed it 6, ran the ball 11 times in the second quarter after they'd seen Maurer make that really bad interception in the first quarter in the red zone, and they decided to go very run heavy in the second quarter. Only threw the ball 1 time in the second quarter, and that was Maurer making the interception that he did. So I think even if Maurer had still been in the game in the second half, I think Tennessee would have stayed with the same game plan they did and been a much a run heavy offense. My whole point in all this, Robert, is to say that I think Tennessee, I think some fans are making a bigger deal about the play calling than what it deserves. And like I said, I was guilty of it at the time. I mentioned on Twitter that I thought the staff just wasn't trusting Garantano when he came in the game. But just going back and looking at it, at the stats, watching the game like I did, kind of rewatching it some, I think that was kind of the idea. Even if Maurer had been in the game, I think after he threw that really bad interception, they didn't trust him to throw the ball a whole lot in the second quarter either. And I think it would have continued in the game. So I think that the people kind of griping a little bit about the play calling and it being really conservative and everything, I just think it's what Jeremy Pruitt and Jim Chaney wanted to do. I think they were trusting the defense that they didn't need to go out and throw it a ton and get their quarterbacks hit anymore or anything like that, and they just wanted to ride it out in the rushing attack. And I think maybe you went a little too conservative at times, but it ended up being the right play call because they got Tennessee the win.
I agree. I mean, at first glance, especially, being at the game in the stands, you put Garantano in, and then you think surely they're going to let him air it out at some point, and it just seemed like never-ending runs, one after another. And then, of course, like we touched on a little bit, they did. They got that 41-yarder to Ramel Keaton from Garantano. But, I mean, if you look at Maurer's start, it was pass, run, pass, which one of those, that second pass by Maurer was one of those bad interceptions, like you mentioned. And then you look at the next drive by Tennessee, the one that they scored on, it's run, pass, run, pass, and then, of course, 2 runs in a row, that last run, of course, being the 15-yarder from Tim Jordan. So, I mean, they'd already established that they were going to be running it pretty heavily at that point, just halfway through the first quarter. And had that first drive not ended by interception by Maurer, I think you would have seen a lot more runs in there as well. So I don't necessarily think they changed the game plan. Would they have thrown a couple more passes here and there if Maurer stays healthy the whole game? I would probably have to say so. But all in all, you could tell right from the get-go, it just felt like, the weather, the overcast. I heard it described almost as as a Big Ten type feel in the stadium, and that's what it was. It was just a lot of runs, and you could tell from those first 2 drives by Tennessee that they were pretty set on establishing the run, because Mississippi State, I mean, they did nothing to prove that they could stop it, and Tennessee really they kept pounding the rock, and I think that, like I said, maybe would have changed just a little, but only marginally had Maurer stayed in.
You mentioned there, Robert, you being in the stands for the game Saturday. This is kind of to changing topics just quite a bit here, but I'm very curious. The announced attendance was around 85,000. I think that was inflated a little bit. I don't think it was inflated maybe as much as some other games have been kind of pushed this year and in years past, but it definitely wasn't the fullest that Neyland Stadium's ever been. It probably wasn't the most rowdy crowd that's ever been in Neyland Stadium. But I am curious, what was your feel of the crowd in Neyland? Because like you said, it was a kind of a dreary day. It was a noon kickoff. It was a game where Tennessee very much had a very winnable game and obviously went out and won it. But it wasn't like it was an SEC East opponent or an Auburn from the West or something like that. It was a Mississippi State team that Tennessee hadn't played in 7 years. They hadn't hosted them in Neyland in over a decade. So what was the crowd like in Neyland Stadium on Saturday?
On Saturday, looking back on the photos, it looks worse than it felt when I was there. Obviously, right at kickoff, most of the lower bowl, I would say, was full. The student section was not great on Saturday, and that remained throughout the whole game. As the first quarter went on, people are trickling in late. It started to fill up. Like I said, most of the lower bowl looked pretty full, minus the student section. The upper bowl was it's probably about 60-40. Of course, most of the upper bowl seats, especially in the south end zone, are reserved for the visiting team. So there was some sprinkles of maroon in there. But I'd say 85,000 is probably a pretty accurate representation. I know, like you said, sometimes it seems as though those are a little inflated, maybe just to boost morale or whatever. But I would say 85,000 is probably an accurate number put on that. But as far as the feel of the stadium and the feel of the crowd, that was honestly one of the more optimistic crowds I remember being a part of, probably since 2016. And of course, those had some crazy games. The first one that comes to mind obviously is Florida. But the crowd stayed in it the whole game, despite there not being, not even close to a sellout, really. Especially on defense. The defense got the momentum. They were getting to the quarterback, ended up with 7 sacks. And then, anytime there's an interception, the crowd went crazy. And I was sitting with a few friends in the south end zone, kind of on the opposite side of the student section. And when Tyler Bird scored that touchdown near the end of the game, our side of the end zone, at least, went absolutely crazy. There was a lot of drive and a lot of – you could tell that the fans were just desperate for something, for anything. So to see Tyler Bird, especially a player, that almost has been forgotten, it seems like, these past couple of years after coming in with a lot of hype 4 years ago. The crowd was in it the whole game, start to finish, offense and defense. And especially on a game, like we've discussed, a game that's not great weather, a game with a lot of run plays where, and not as many huge, pass plays, nothing like a Big 12 showdown or anything like that, not even close. The crowd remained positive the whole way through. And that, obviously I'm a Tennessee student and grown up in Tennessee my whole life. So on my homer side of things, that's good to see. And I do think that's good for the program, that even in a game where the weather's not great, you're playing a meh opponent in Mississippi State, or at least a lot of people are going to view them as that. It's not like you said, an Auburn from the West. To see that kind of hype and that kind of passion from the crowd, even with underrepresented, I guess, with just 85,000, it was a good feel at the game for sure.
Good. I was very curious, not being there at the actual stadium. I was curious about how it was, and that's awesome. Like you said, it's good for the program that that the fans were still that engaged with everything. Like you said, even with all the factors kind of going against, with the fact that the season started the way it has. Tennessee's been blown out in 2 SEC games, and I know obviously the Georgia game, it felt different. It didn't maybe feel like a 29-point loss like it ended up being on the scoreboard, but it was still a loss where you kind of lost control in the fourth quarter. The Florida game was not fun to watch. Vol fans were treated to the Georgia State loss and BYU loss at home this year. So I agree with you. I think it is a good sign that while the attendance numbers were still not, where you would like them to be, the fact that they were still over 80,000 plus, and like you said, they were engaged kind of the whole time too. That's very promising, and that's a very good sign for things to come. And speaking of things to come for the rest of this season, Tennessee is now 2-4. They picked up their first SEC win of the season, 1-2 in the SEC play. They've got a date against Alabama this weekend. That's going to go how it's going to go. I don't think anyone, even the biggest Tennessee fans, I don't think they're expecting that one to even be close. It hasn't been close since that 2015 game where Tennessee was coming off a bye week and Bama was playing like their, I think, 7th or 8th straight game. Tennessee, I mean, to their credit, Tennessee was a very physical football team that year, and they gave Alabama all they wanted. They had a lead against them in the fourth quarter, and Bama just ended up, being Bama, and they ran, I think it was Derrick Henry. He just ended up just pounding Tennessee's defense, and they scored that game-winning touchdown in the fourth quarter. Since then, it's just been, Bama's dominated Tennessee the last 12 years. They've won 12 straight against them, but Tennessee's just been massacred by the Tide the last 3 seasons. They've lost by 30-plus points in 3 consecutive games to Alabama. Last year, the Tide could have dropped 80 points on Tennessee, and they didn't. They relented and only dropped 58, which is actually still the most points an Alabama team has ever scored against Tennessee in the series history. And these two teams have been playing, not every single year, but they've been playing for over 100 years. And that was the most points that Alabama had ever scored against the Vols last year, in that 58-21 just beating that Tennessee took. Like I said, it could have been a lot worse. Aside from that, though, every single game remaining on Tennessee's schedule is winnable. I think some obviously more than others. I still don't think Tennessee's going to be able to beat Missouri. I know they lost Kel Garrett for the season, which I think for the season, but he's a big piece of that defense. And I do think that one, to me, lines up a little favorably for Tennessee in the fact that of where it is on the schedule for them compared to Missouri, because Tennessee will be coming off a bye week playing the Tigers. Missouri will be playing Georgia and Florida in back-to-back weeks before they take on Tennessee. So I think that could play the Tennessee's favor that way. But aside from the Bama game, every single game remaining, the other 5 games on Tennessee's schedule against South Carolina, against UAB, against Kentucky, Missouri, and Vanderbilt, those are all winnable games. And if Tennessee could somehow, they lose to Bama this weekend, and if they lose one other game, probably, I think, in my opinion, to Missouri. If they win the other 4 games, we're talking about Tennessee still making a bowl game even after the disastrous start they had to the season, which I think a lot of all fans at this point would definitely take. But to me, Robert, and I'll let you kind of have your thoughts first, then I'll give mine. Does this win over Mississippi State, how much does it kind of bolster your opinions on the season? How much does it really change what you think is going to happen in the remaining 6 games of the year? I guess maybe 5, not counting the Alabama game. How much does this kind of give you more confidence on the season? Does it really change anything a whole lot for you? What's your opinion now on the rest of Tennessee's 2019 season after the way they beat Mississippi State on Saturday?
I think Saturday's game against Mississippi State was absolutely pivotal for the program. Not just even for the season, but you're talking about for recruiting, the future, like years to come, potentially, obviously once that you start out 1-4 and, you have some people, I'm not saying even most, but you do have some people out there calling for Pruitt to be fired after you go 1-4, especially obviously the fashion they did, losing to Georgia State and then giving the game away against BYU there in that second week. But winning against Mississippi State was pivotal, absolutely pivotal for the future of the program. And to say that, you look at the schedule, Alabama, South Carolina, UAB, at Kentucky, then like you said, you've got the bye week at Missouri, and then back home in Neyland for the final game against Vanderbilt. To even say now that, a bowl game is very much on the table, and almost even likely for Tennessee. It's something almost nobody was saying going into Mississippi State, or going in before Tennessee played Mississippi State. You chalk up Alabama most likely as a loss, barring just a whole series of freak events. That's just the way things shake out, with the talent being where it is now, being at Alabama, all of that, of course. You chalk that one up as a loss, and then you think, okay, well, if you're Tennessee, you got to win 4 out of 5. And then, like you said, you look at the schedule. I think winning 4 out of 5 is doable. South Carolina going into Georgia and then upsetting them in double overtime is huge. So now you're looking at South Carolina maybe perhaps more formidable than a lot of people thought. And then UAB, that one's probably a win if you're just, kind of looking at, obviously, the conferences, things like that. And then you go at Kentucky, at Missouri, Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt, I would think at this point, if Tennessee plays like they did against Mississippi State, you figure that one's probably a win because Vanderbilt just looked awful against UNLV at home. And then then it's basically you've got to split Kentucky and Missouri there at the very end of the meat of that schedule. And I think that's doable. Like you said, I think you could absolutely go to Kentucky, steal a game there. And then you've got a bye week against Missouri. I think Missouri's the better team, but you've got a bye week and then you go on the road there. And I think they could steal the game there as well. I just think a lot of it, honestly, just depends on consistency. And that's something that this Tennessee team really hasn't shown this season. They've shown flashes of, having great defense. And then, of course, on Saturday against Mississippi State, they showed great defense the whole game. But in other games, like against Florida, they had 2 interceptions, but they still got gashed. A bunch of short throws, slants across the middle, things like that. The secondary, for most of the game, despite getting those picks, was still getting torched. So I just think it depends on, can Tennessee build upon this and look at the film from Saturday and kind of use that as the template going forward, saying, okay, this is what we've got to do. We're probably not going to go, depending how, Maurer develops throughout the season, and maybe it could, but you're probably not going to go out there and, throw the ball over the field and, blow out probably anybody the rest of the way. But the offensive line has proved that they can create holes for the running backs. They proved they can, make some more time for the quarterbacks. The defensive line has proved that they can get to opposing quarterbacks. We saw 7 sacks on Saturday. So it's definitely maintaining consistency. And I think if Tennessee can do that and continue to improve week by week, then I think a bowl game is likely. And that's not something I would have said before Saturday's game was over.
Yeah, I think that's fair too. To me, I wonder. I look at this game. Obviously, like I said earlier, it's the best team effort I think Tennessee's given all season, and I think it's a culmination of a lot of things. I said this in the live show on Saturday afternoon. I think Tennessee was getting better week after week after the first game of the season. Obviously, that game is just inexcusable. I don't care. I don't care what you say. I don't care what happened in that game. Tennessee should not have lost that game to Georgia State. That falls squarely on the coaches. It also falls on the players because, ultimately they're the ones executing it out on the field. But the coaches didn't have them ready, and that game will forever, just be one of the biggest head-scratching losses in Tennessee history. But they did show improvement in an effort, at least from effort and everything against BYU, but execution was still very much lacking. Even against Florida, if you had better quarterback play, I don't think Tennessee wins that game, but you're more competitive in that game and you put more points on the board than you did if Garantano doesn't play kind of as poorly as he did. And then you threw in Brian Maurer the second half, who showed some flashes. Against Georgia, you still you saw more progress in that game. And as I said on Saturday, it wasn't being reflected necessarily on the scoreboard. Tennessee was still getting blown out by Florida and blown out by Georgia, but there are definitely different aspects of the team, different units were showing progress and were showing growth week to week. And then finally on Saturday, to me, it looked like like I said earlier, all the units showed growth. And maybe the linebackers didn't have as strong of a game as they've had in recently, but they still didn't, they didn't play poorly. The offensive line showed a really good game. The quarterbacks did a good enough job. I think maybe the receivers probably had the weakest game they've had all season, but they still didn't play poorly. Same thing like linebackers. They still didn't play bad. They just didn't have maybe as good of a game as they had played all season. But then every other aspect of the team upped their game. The secondary had easily the best game of their season so far. Same thing for the defensive line. I think same thing for the offensive line. Running backs played good enough, and I think quarterbacks played good enough. To me, I wonder, though, I don't want to discount Tennessee from their win because this is a win they very much earned. It wasn't like Mississippi State. necessarily choked away or anything like that and gave them this game. Tennessee very much earned this win. At the same time, though, I thought Mississippi State handled this game poorly. I thought head coach Joe Moorhead for the Bulldogs, I thought he made several just very, very bad decisions. For one, I don't know why he started Tommy Stevens at quarterback. That seemed like the wrong move from the get-go to me. I thought all week that if Stevens was healthy, he might get the start, but I thought they might be better off going to Garrett Schrader because he's more mobile. He gives that offense a little bit more of a dimension. He's not the great thrower, but Stevens showed also he's apparently not a good thrower. His 2 interceptions, all the interceptions thrown in this game, all 5 of them, they were all just really bad throws. It wasn't necessarily a defensive back making a great read or the defense disguising something and tricking the quarterback into thinking he had a guy open and throwing an interception that was just, like I said, a good defensive play. It was I think all 5 of them, at least 4 of them, were just really bad throws by the quarterbacks. For Brian Maurer, for Tommy Stevens, and Garrett Schrader, they're all just, I think all of them were all just really bad throws. But I think starting Stevens and then not just starting him and not working Garrett Schrader into the game, period, in the first half, that to me was just a very boneheaded decision by Joe Moorhead. I don't want to be too critical of him, but I just think that was a very poor decision by him because you brought Garrett Schrader into the second half. Obviously, he's still not a great thrower. He finished 5 of 10 for 79 yards, a touchdown, and interception. But his second half stats, he came into the game, he ran the ball 13 times for 62 yards. It wasn't like he had just one big run that was most of the yardage. He had a 14-yard run. So, I mean, that was still, he's picking up chunky yards here and there. He was doing things that I thought, in my opinion, I thought he brought a little bit of a spark to Mississippi State's offense. Obviously, they only ended up scoring 1 touchdown, but he did help them score their only touchdown of the game in the fourth quarter. I also think it was a mistake to maybe turn away from Kylan Hill like you did. Obviously, he was getting bottled up big time, and Tennessee, that's the biggest, to me, that's the biggest positive from this game was Tennessee holding the SEC leading rusher to 13 yards on 11 carries. But if you bring Garrett Schrader in there earlier in the game, or maybe if you even start him, does that change, kind of the holes Kylan Hill gets? Does that change kind of the way Tennessee's defense operates, and they have to be more wary of a read option or just a regular option play, a pitch play? I mean, it to me, the whole starting Tommy Stevens thing, the kind of going away from Kylan Hill a little bit from it obviously wasn't working a ton, but they could have done a little more than what they did. I just thought it was a very poorly called game offensively for Mississippi State. I just I also wonder how good Mississippi State actually is. Is this an instance where Tennessee looks like a really good team, but then you realize, oh wait, maybe Mississippi State's just really bad, or they're at least not very good. That's my only kind of hesitancy of saying this is going to be a huge turning point for the season for Tennessee, because I don't really know how good Mississippi State actually is. Obviously, they got blown out by Auburn. And in that game also, though, you can point to and say, hey, they didn't have their suspended players in for that game. But they had them in for Tennessee, and they lost 20-10. They also had them in for the Kentucky game, and they beat Kentucky by 2 scores. But that one, I think, that one's was probably Mississippi State's best game of the season because they beat Kentucky by 2 scores, but it wasn't even that close. I mean, they were up 21-3 at halftime, and Kentucky could do nothing until kind of second half. They got a few points on the board there. But Robert, that's my only hesitancy, and maybe that's just kind of the negativity of me popping up because I've seen Tennessee football the last 3 or 4 years, and I've been trained to kind of maybe be more negative than positive. But to me, that's kind of the one thing I keep worrying about. And Ben McKee and I talked about this last week about Brian Maurer and his start against Georgia. Was that maybe a flash in the pan for him? Maybe was that just that good first career start for him? Was that just kind of a lucky kind of first start? The fact that Georgia didn't really have any film on him. Maybe I kind of wonder the same thing on this one. Could this be a flash in the pan? Maybe am I just not showing enough faith in this team, Robert? Because like I said earlier, they have shown improvement every single week, and I would lean probably a little more towards, hey, this could be kind of a turning point for the season. But I'm also I have quite a bit of hesitancy at the same time because teams rarely, I think Tennessee, I don't think they played quite to their peak. They still made quite a bit of mistakes. Like I said, Maurer threw 2 bad interceptions. You still had some, while the tackling and gang tackling overall was a lot better in this game, you still had some execution issues on defense and some coverage busts by the linebackers and some poor tackling by a few players. So they didn't play up to their peak necessarily, but teams rarely kind of play, their B+ to A+ games super consistently, unless you're just an Alabama or a Clemson or an Ohio State, teams like that, or maybe even LSU this year. You don't consistently play your B plus to A plus games. You're more likely to play kind of a C to a B game, and you'll obviously have games like the Georgia State game where you're playing a D to an F. But I wonder how many more types of these performances Tennessee has in them, and if they're going to run into a team that is just going to be playing their B plus to A plus type of game when they play them. So maybe I'm just being a little bit more of a quote unquote negaval because I've just watched Tennessee over the last 10, 15 years as a fan, and also covering in the last 4 years, 5 years at this point. So Robert, do you think I'm being too negative? Do you think I'm being a negaval and not maybe showing an appropriate enough kind of confidence in this team moving forward?
I mean, I think at this point, being a negaval is just being a Vol fan. But I mean, kidding a little bit. But no, I mean, you said the last, you've been, you've kind of got maybe perhaps a bit more pessimism because of the last 3 or 4 years. But I mean, realistically, it's been, the last decade plus, honestly, minus a couple of outliers there in 15 and 16. But I mean, I think it's a fair point, obviously, to make that, winning one game against Mississippi State, who is probably a middle of the pack to even slightly below average SEC team. I mean, to say that, this being like your biggest win of the season, and, is this really going to translate the rest of the road or the rest of the way down the road in the SEC? I don't know. But I think it's definitely a step in the right direction. And then when you look at, the other side of it is that your only other win on the season is against FCS team Chattanooga. You lost to Georgia State, and you think, oh, that game's before you come into the season, you think, oh, that game's for sure a win. No need to worry, completely overlook it on the schedule. And then, of course, now looking back, that was a loss in your home opener. So I think it's fair to be critical, obviously, of maybe the quality of the opponent of Mississippi State, and even this Tennessee team, like we both said, has been inconsistent. But I think it's a step in the right direction, and it is it's a culmination of improvements each week. The team has been inconsistent, but like you said, even against Georgia, the score was probably not indicative of how well Tennessee actually played. And then if you go back even to Florida, had Maurer maybe gotten a start in that game, would Tennessee have won? I don't know, probably not. But the game certainly seemed to change a little bit once he was put in at that game. So I would say it's fair to critique this win, and fair even to critique the lookout for the rest of the season, and fair to say that this Tennessee team may not make a bowl. But I think if you can put together games like this, this, like you said, is probably Tennessee's A game, B plus game, whatever you want to call it. It's definitely up there as their best performance of the season. And is a young Tennessee team like this going to put up their B plus or their A game every week? Probably not. But if they can make improvements in areas each week, I think you can kind of raise the level of what your, maybe your B or your B minus actually is. But then on the flip side, like you said, that's why the Alabamas, the Clemsons, that's why they are, they put their A game out there every week, and that's why they're obviously, 2 playoff teams as of right now. And then you look even to Clemson football, they had, a pretty close game a couple of weeks ago. I want to say it was against UNC, but they put out maybe their C or even like D game, and we're still able to get the win. So I think that's the difference. Is Tennessee just has to continue to raise its level of what a good game is, and I think they've done that so far. So I would have to agree with you that Mississippi State isn't the best opponent, but Tennessee has shown improvement each week, and I think this was just kind of one of those weeks where that little improvement week by week, whether it be, the offensive line making strides each week or the secondary making some strides each week. I think this was just the perfect culmination of all of that. and you saw all of the position groups really come out and give it. Probably, aside from the quarterbacks, who even Garantano, when he came in, he managed the game very well. They all went out there and put out, arguably their best game of the season at each position group.
I think it's a good take. I think that's you mentioning there that raising the level of kind of your B- game. I think that's a good quote. That's a good way of looking at it there too. And like I said, I'm not saying this is going to be Tennessee's only win until UAB or Vanderbilt or anything like that, because I definitely think Tennessee, they should beat UAB, they should be able to beat Kentucky, and they should be able to beat Vandy. It's whether or not they can get wins against South Carolina and Missouri that are going to end up defining how this season goes for them. And that's going to be interesting to watch. And I do feel more optimistic about this team after this. I'll be very curious to see what happens with Maurer, how they handle him the rest of this week, if they start him or play him against Alabama. I think they will. You can debate whether or not you think it's the right decision or not, based off of, this isn't actually the same type of Alabama defense that we're used to seeing. They've actually allowed quite a bit of points this season, just briefly looking at their stats. I know, they gave up the opening touchdown to Texas A&M, and then obviously the offense kind of started pouring on. They ended up trailing 7-0, and then they held, I think, a 24-10 halftime lead over Texas A&M. They ended up winning that game by 19 points, 47-28. But still 28 points. That's not the amount of points they're used to seeing an Alabama defense give up. And on the season right now, actually, Bama, looking at their stats, they have 15 sacks on the year, which is tied with like a million other SEC schools for fifth in the SEC. Florida has 26. Ole Miss has 18. Auburn has 17. Arkansas has 16. And then Georgia, South Carolina, Kentucky, LSU, Alabama, and Tennessee all have 15. So they're all tied for fifth. And then you go to Missouri with 12, and then it kind of goes down from there. So they don't have, they're not like a team that's just stockpiling a ton of sacks on the year, which that's something you tend to think about with Alabama, as they are very sack happy. They did get 5 against Texas A&M. That was easily their most. Against South Carolina, they had 3. Against Ole Miss, they only had 1. So you look at that and you're thinking, okay, this isn't maybe the type of Bama defense you're used to. They're allowing 17 points a game, which, like I said, that's good. But you look generally, Alabama in the last few years, they've been giving up a lot less than that. That's actually, that's with games against Duke, New Mexico State, and Southern Miss. In SEC play, they've given up 23, they've given up 31, and they've given up 28, and that's to South Carolina, to Ole Miss, and Texas A&M. So, to me, I'd be very curious to see kind of what happens with Tennessee this weekend, and I do expect them to score some points. I don't think it'll be another kind of 40-10 type of game for Tennessee against Alabama, but I still don't think obviously they'll win. But I think this game is important for the rest of the season. This game gives Tennessee a win they absolutely had to have. But I think you can learn some things. I think you can gain some things in the Alabama game as well. Even if you can't win that one or don't win that one, I still think there are things you can do to prepare yourself and prepare your team for future success. But I think that'll be where we end the podcast here. Robert, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast here. I'll plug where everybody can kind of listen or find all the stuff. I think most people listening to the podcast know where all the RTI stuff is. But if they want to follow your work and keep up with you, not just the stuff that you do for RTI, where can they follow you on Twitter, and where can they interact with you?
Well, on Twitter, I am at Robert M. Hughes 9. That's definitely where I post just about everything as far as social media goes. I'm not super active on Facebook or Instagram, so definitely, I would appreciate the follow at Robert M. Hughes 9 on Twitter. I typically retweet everything that I do over there with RTI. I appreciate the time on the podcast. Always good to discuss a little Tennessee football, especially after where a game where wins have been not exactly in abundance on the season. So getting to discuss a win, always a pleasure. Appreciate you having me on the show.
Absolutely, man. Like I said, we'll do stuff in the future. If not just football stuff, we'll be doing basketball stuff at some time in the future as well. So I'm happy to have you on. If this is your first time listening to the podcast, we really appreciate you tuning in. For this, your first episode after a win. Like Robert said, it's always a lot more fun to do these things. Articles, podcasts, videos, it's always a lot more fun to do after a win than a loss. So we appreciate you all tuning in. You can subscribe to the podcast and listen to us in a multitude of ways. We're on Apple Podcasts. If you have an Android device, you can listen to us in whatever kind of podcast catcher app you use on your Android phone. You can subscribe to us on YouTube. That's a way that a lot of you listen and interact with our podcast, and we also post a lot of videos. We have post-game videos up there from the game of Tennessee's players celebrating on the field and with fans after the game. So if you want to check it out, we also have post-game interviews from players. We'll have interviews and stuff from Jeremy Pruitt. Basketball season, we've got stuff from Rick Barnes, Tennessee's players and stuff on there as well. So we're going to have tons of video stuff for you. We'll do the podcast video as well, so that's why people leave comments and kind of interact with the podcast that way too. So we appreciate all of you tuning in that way. We appreciate all of you tuning in this way, and however you're listening to us, however you're reading our content, we're very, very much appreciative. But until next time, this has been another episode of the RTI Podcast.